Gerater fundit për sot është Antoine Wilmering nga Getty Foundation, në fakt është e pejtë Keeping It Modern, granti të programit në iniciativës Getty Foundation. Kjo është organizata që ka financu edhe studimin tonë për konservimin dhe planin e menaxhimit të bibliotekës kombëtare. Do shta keni pa dhe ekspozitin që kena në bibliotekë, edhe është libri për rrugë që kena para disa mujve, në bledhën soma nëse dikush. Realisht, pak veç për projektin tonë një tregu është plani para konservimit në menaxhimit për një objekt të modernizmit në region tonë. Fakt edhe janë edhe disa përfitues tash vit në ashëm kanë me qenë të Keeping It Modern, edhe fatkesisht është program që ka më përmbyll shumë shpejt. Ma shumë për programin edhe që kam shtesin në Keeping It Modern, programin ka me folë Antoine. Antoine, please.
Thank you, Becca, and thank you for having invited me here. I should maybe start out by saying I'm not an architect, so I'm in strange waters here because I think you're all architects or aspiring to be architects. My background and training is in furniture making and furniture restoration, so it's very different. But because of my background in restoration, I was offered a job at the Getty Foundation, where I'm responsible for managing our international conservation grant making. And one of these initiatives is Keeping It Modern, and I'm going to talk about that. And actually, let me go back. What you see here on the slide is the Getty Center, or part of it, built by Richard Meyer. And most of the architecture that I'll be talking about today are individual buildings, and very much is formal architecture. So different from yesterday's and today's speaker. So Keeping It Modern aims to draw attention to the problems that the conservation of modern architecture brings. And as you probably all know, architecture of the, that's considered modern in the 20th century. Most of the architecture in the world was built in the 20th century. So there was a tremendous building boom after the First World War and after the Second World War. So that represents the building stock what we're looking at. Now the Getty Foundation is nestled in the Getty Trust. And the Getty Trust has a research institute for art history. That's an area that is of great interest to the Getty. We have a conservation institute, which is also of great interest to the Getty. We have a museum and the foundation. And we're actually one of the smallest programs within the Getty. Now, we have always had an interest in architecture, whether it's ancient architecture, whether it's architectural drawings or photographs or archives, or whether it's architecture of prefabricated architecture in the Antarctic. So we have had a lot of interest, and we've been funding in the field for more than 30 years. Keeping It Modern is not an initiative by itself, but it is aligned by the Conservation of Modern Architecture initiative of the Getty Conservation Institute. And we're housed in the same building at the Getty. They very much get active on the ground, so they do projects on the ground. We fund, and our grants are peer-reviewed, so when a grant gets awarded, it has gone through a thorough peer review process, which is a guarantee for the quality of the project. Now, why do we preserve modern architecture? I mean, showing this slide, I don't really have to explain, right? It's an expression of who we felt we were in the 20th century. It's an expression of the times. It's an expression of different societies, different communities, and it's a great shame that that gets erased or demolished. As you can see here at the Orange County Center on the left in New York, Prentice Hall in Chicago, and I think this is a government building in Bangladesh on the right side. As I said before, we have funded in architecture conservation since the late 1980s, and it mostly focused on ancient architecture, although there were moments that we were able to support modern architecture as well. And you know, I'm sure you know Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall. You may be less familiar with Shackleton's hut in the Antarctic, which only 2 or 3 weeks out of the year is not frozen. The rest of the time of the year is frozen. And a large conservation project is underway there, and also preserving artifacts. If you have interest in this, do go online and see what they're doing. They have a website and make regular updates. So, why do we focus on modern architecture? Well, we know that the 20th century has a building boom, a tremendous building boom. There's new optimism, growing economies, and that brings with it trying of new materials, trying new building methods, trying materials that have never been used in the building, like aluminum or large glass panes or curtain walls. So all kinds of methods that in the previous centuries didn't exist. And the new building materials and these new building systems, they were tested by engineers maybe, and they were felt to be lasting for a long time, were strong enough for the code of what was prevalent during that time, but they were not really tested for endurance or for durability. And that gives actually an enormous challenge today for conservation. And Bekim would probably notice that when you have parents who are doctors or siblings who are doctors, when you have a patient, they need to first see and test, what is the issue before you prescribe medication. But as you know, not different with architecture. I mean, when you have a problem, you first need to know what the problem is, where it comes from, before you can do any intervention. And what we're promoting with Keeping It Modern is that you do this research, so that you look at the design drawings, that you look at the building itself, how it was built, because that, as you know, that can differ from the design. And also you need to understand how the building has performed over time. And then you analyze the materials, look at the performance, and then you place a value on that, right? This tower by Frank Lloyd Wright in Oklahoma is basically his only tower. So there are values on this building, and there's a significance on this building that you normally may not consider, but when you take a moment to sort of stand still, look at it, look at the materials, look at the drawings, you begin, the building begins to reveal itself, it begins to show itself. And from there you can deduct what the significance is and what the values are. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with Keeping It Modern. We're supporting research and analysis and planning projects, so that when you move to intervention, so that when you move to doing repairs, you're actually informed. You know what, where the issues come from. You know what the architect was intending to do with the building. You know how the building has changed over time. The Price Tower that you see on the screen was built as a institutional, as a organizational headquarters. But now it is not. It is used as a cultural center and as a hotel. So and many of the hotel rooms still have original features. So you can, as a heritage tourist, you can rent rooms in this hotel, and you can also take, work together or partake in cultural events. The same thing in the children's library in Ghana. It's a concrete building with a beautiful brise-soleil, and there too, the building cannot be used anymore the way it was used in 1966, right after the independence. So it's another library, like the one here in Pristina. When you consider a new use, or when you consider the standards of comfort and the codes of today, you may have to go carefully about upgrading this building so that it still can be used, but and at the same time, sort of, you preserve the significance. So at the same time, you look at the features and determine what matters now, what the values we have now, which actually can differ from what the values were in 1966, and make an informed decision on how to adapt the building or how to create the building, use the building so that it's pleasant to use and sustainable. And sustainable is not only energy sustainable, but also use, circulation, opening hours, etc. So our broadest goal is really to sort of advance the understanding in stewardship and conservation of 20th century architecture. So we do that by supporting projects that we call model projects. So projects that stand out in a way and then can serve in, like here in, for example, with the library, can serve as a model of practice. So the conservation plan that was prepared by Bekim, Knoll, and their colleagues, that becomes a model, not only for the library, but actually also for other buildings. This Marcel Breuer restaurant, or little hotel, is actually still in its state that you see on the right slide. It's in Argentina, and this is actually a building that should not be lost. So it would be important for people who own this to take action and research the building and come up with a conservation plan. If not, if they fail to do that, the building is bound to disappear. And in my mind, that would be a great loss. Sydney Opera House, very iconic building. And this is a strategy that has not so much to do with architecture, but this is a strategy of grant making. When you want to draw attention to a particular problem, when you are able to work with an iconic building, then it gets more attention. So we were in discussion with Sydney Opera House, and they explained to us that they had enormous problems with the concrete under the shells. I don't know if I can. Let's go back. Okay, there's no point. So they had enormous problems with the concrete under the shells. They couldn't assess, they couldn't understand what was going on below the tiles. At the same time, you can see on the black and white slide on the left that the concrete is in direct contact with the sea, with the ocean. So there's erosion going on, and Sydney Opera House was in need of developing a special strategy for preserving the concrete. And other than sort of going person by person on the roof, you can see that area there, they developed a little robot with a hammer, and that goes around and that hammers the shells, and that way they can monitor what the state of the concrete is. It's a very well developed plan, and they have not done this in isolation. They work together with students of the architecture school in Sydney and with the engineering department in Sydney. So in collaboration with the specialists at the university and the people in the field, they drew up a really interesting plan by which they are able to monitor the concrete. The same with St. John's Abbey in the United States. Beautiful Marcel Breuer building. If you want to understand the scale of this church, look at the upper left slide and you see a tiny person taking a photograph. So that's the scale of this abbey. And look at the stained glass and look at the proportions. It's just a fabulous building. And when you draw up a conservation plan and when you understand what the issues are with the concrete, you can not only develop a strategy for making repairs in the next 2 or 3 years, but you can also develop a strategy to monitor the concrete and repair the concrete over the next 2 decades. And in fact, you can keep doing that. So by creating a plan, you also create a system by which you can budget, by which you can sort of calculate your expenditures rather than after 20 or 30 years having to do an enormous intervention. You can do little by little by little, and that way budget and be more cost effective, and in a way more sustainable. So our funding supports research and analysis, and that's very much what has happened here at the library. The development or the writing of a conservation plan or management plan. In some occasions we give implementation support, but out of 56 grants that we have given to date, we have only given 2 implementation grants. We bring once per year the grantees and the consultants of each year's projects together. So before I came here to Pristina, I was in London a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, and we met with the grantees of 2017 and talked about issues of conservation planning and conservation management planning. And that way they can hear each other's stories. They know that they're not alone trying to struggle through understanding a building, and the network they create is lasting, so they can, even after they get home, ask each other, contact each other about how they solve certain problems. And you'll be, it's no surprise perhaps that the issues are often overlapping, even though the building may be very different in architectural expression or even with the materials, but the underlying issues are very similar. And then the last strategy that we have is that we want to share the outcomes of the grant projects with the field. And we will be doing that by via the internet. And either later this month or in August, we'll be launching a portal on the Keeping It Modern website. And that will have the first 10 or 15 reports that came out of the 2014 and 2015 grants. So those projects that have finished, that have completed writing their conservation management plan, we ask them for permissions, and once we have those, they will be added to the portal. And once they're there, they can be downloaded free of charge, or they can be viewed there and inform other projects. So if you're ever stuck with a project and you want to know how at Sydney Opera House they created their conservation concrete strategy, you can download it and carry it on your tablet or see it on your computer. So that's a way to spread the information beyond the projects and make it available. So I'm just going to cycle through a number of examples. I'm a little bit aware of the time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly, if that's okay with you. These are some of the grants that we supported. So very early building of 1913, an amazing structure. If you ever have time, go on YouTube. They created a little video on how this building was actually put together. It's very interesting. And they created a conservation management plan based on the historic research they did, based on testing of the concrete, so based on a lot of information, building physics, engineering studies, and it's all put together not only in a publication, which you see on the left and which will be available through the portal, but they also used it on their computer system, so it's an integrated plan, integrated with their regular management schedules. So that's actually very useful. Another beautiful building is by Kenzo Tange, is the Yoyogi Stadium of 1964, which I remember actually when I was a kid. I watched the 1964 Olympics. Here's an aerial view and an interior view. And in 1966, on a little black and white television, it was the Dutch judoka Anton Geesink who defeated the Japanese contender and became the first non-Japanese champion in free weight. So that was a live broadcast, was spectacular. At the Sag Institute by Louis Kahn, built over several years in the 1960s, the GCI and the Getty Foundation worked together, and we supported the creation of a conservation management plan, and the GCI worked on a project there to help restore the teak windows. I can't elaborate at the moment on the teak windows, but I'll show you that they received a second grant, and the second grant is to start making repairs to the concrete. And you can see here that the research that lay at the bottom of this, making these repairs, is very solid. So you can see how carefully they aimed at matching the color, but also the texture of the concrete. And you do that by researching the aggregate, by researching the mixtures. So, and it may seem like a very precious approach, but when you look at the Sag Institute, you know, each wall basically is a canvas. So each wall it has such a presence that if you start making, if you go to Home Depot and you get a bag of ready mix and you just slap it on a damage, you're going to see you're going to create such an ugly patchwork that you may as well not repair it at all. So if you're going to make repairs, then they are actually having developed the right approach by ensuring that the surface texture, the consistency, and the color of the concrete matches. The same project, but with different people, they're undertaking in Sao Paulo at the School of Architecture and Urban Planning. The beauty with this project is that there are architectural students involved. So that's the students of the architecture department, preservation department. So they will see these new technologies and these new methods, and will be able to take some of that forward in their own practices later on. Baking will remember that we met with one of his colleagues today, and we spoke about the importance of reflecting pools. And here is a beautiful building, Gandhi Bhagwan by Pierre Jeanneret, in a state where the reflecting pool is not functioning and there was no conservation plan. Now that has changed, and you see the conservation plan is in place. And as a test, they were trying to see how much water could be retained in the reflecting pool. And I think after some minor repairs, they basically had no loss of water, and the building gains momentum because basically you reflect the entire surface, reflect the entire structure. So you create a mass that's not there. And you as architects probably know this much better than me, and probably can articulate it much better than me, but sort of the building gains in gravitas. Other issues are with other buildings. Not every building receives funding for a conservation management plan. At the Einstein Tower in Germany, they have still today, continuing issues with water ingress. A little bit like the library here, where water comes in through the ground, and also water comes in, after rainfall. And in order to find a sustainable solution for energy efficiency and trying to dry out the building, they made a study to see whether the computer center, the heat generated by the computers, could be used to circulate through the building and help dry it out. And they've actually been successful, so that project will be developed. And it's based on very thorough study at the Solar Observatory. So the observatory is still used, and it dates back to 1921. So it's quite a remarkable building and an interesting problem to solve. Almost at the same time is the Rietveld House in Utrecht, Rietveld Schröder House. And so when you compare this by Mendelssohn and compare this by Rietveld, only 3 years apart, but very different structures, and therefore very different conservation problems. The building was lived in until maybe the 80s or early 90s, and then donated to the museum, the Central Museum in Utrecht. And they show it now that it's open as a museum building, as a house museum. But in order to restore it, they had to do very thorough color studies. They looked at the designs. They spoke with Bertus Mulder, who's the man in the black and white photograph. He was a long-time collaborator of Rietveld. So through an oral history with him and taking him through the house and asking what he did to the house before, they gained a better understanding of the history, and they gained a better understanding where interventions had been more heavy-handed in the past and where interventions had been done more lightly. A similar approach was used by Beckham, where he and his colleagues could interview the original architect and ask him about his design principles, about his thinking for designing the library, and also have him reflect on how it appeared today. So all that is actually very useful, and I should maybe mention that the Rietveld-Schröder House is a World Heritage Site, and so is Sydney Opera House, and so is Centennial Hall. So these buildings that you may think of, good quality architecture, and they may be in architecture books 101, but they're not only great architecture, they're of universal value. They make such a statement at any given point in time that they become important for humanity across time, and that's reflected in them receiving World Heritage listing and making them important, sort of subscribing to the issue of universal value. Just briefly showing the Gropius House. A previous speaker mentioned that Gropius moved to Harvard, and he built his own house there, and it's in the hands of Historic New England. It's also a house museum, and also is doing research on preservation issues. Very quickly, the Casa de Vidro by Lina Bobardi. So with the Rietveld House, with the Gropius House, with Lina Bobardi's house, you not only have buildings that are significant in their own right, but they're also architects' houses. So there's perhaps another layer of interest, another layer of learning that you can have with those houses, because when you investigate the progression over time, you can also interpret some of the architects' thinking over time. This is the MASPI, the Fine Art Museum in Sao Paulo, also designed by Lina Bobardi. They have a grant for an engineering study because these huge red beams that you see, those feet that are coming down, the beams span the entire length of the museum, and they are sagging by about 60 centimeters. So the museum is hanging down from those beams. They may have to do a pretty significant intervention if indeed they find that the building is at risk. What you also see here is interior of the old gallery in black and white, and then a recently restored and reopened gallery. And you see the absolute unique way that Lina Bobardi thought about displaying paintings. So they shouldn't, according to her, they shouldn't just hang on the wall, but they should be visible throughout the space, and you should be able to look through them, as it were. So she created these concrete and glass paned easels, and that's where the paintings hang from. And it gives a really interesting effect, as if they were floating off the floor. Quickly skip this. This is a building by James Strutt in Canada. So it's also an architect's house. The same as the Eames House, of course, very important. At this house, the Conservation Institute, so our colleagues, they are preparing a conservation management plan. They will be ready sometime later this year. And we funded a detailed color study of the interiors, because when you know the Eameses and when you have some knowledge of the spaces that they surrounded themselves with, these are really symphonies of color and textures and materials. So it is very hard to grasp how that progressed or what goes with what. So by just doing a thorough investigation and by documenting that information, you can then begin to learn how they change their views of the interior over time. Another grant went to the George Nakashima house, so that's in a way, there's great similarity with the Strutt house, same construction issues, and those grantees can exchange information and learn from each other. And the Nakashima Conservation Management Plan will be placed online when the portal opens. I'm still aware of time, so I'm trying to cut it down, my presentation. But of course, you know the Pineal Sanatorium by Alto, which is also a fabulous building of the 1930s. Even today, I think it's just a super modern building. But when he designed it, he not only did the architecture on the outside, he designed every element in the building. The door handles, the light fixtures, the windows, and he hired an artist to work on the colors. The reason he did that is that he didn't want to build a sanatorium, just a building, but he wanted the building to function as a medical instrument. So he was incredibly precise about every detail in it. And much of, I mean, the building has been used for a hospital for many years, so not all features have been preserved. But there's still a whole lot of information that can be gleaned, and there's still, actually there was a whole cache of windows and extra chairs and lamps in the basement because they had foreseen that some of it would wear out, so they had made extras. So that's on a side note. Looking at interior colors for any architecture is important, and I think especially for architecture of the modern movement or the early expressionist architecture. So here you have Pineal, here you have Le Corbusier, and this is his own studio in his own house in the Molitor building in Paris. So, you know, at the same time almost, look at this is 1930, 1933. Le Corbusier worked on his own apartment. So to be able to understand these color studies and look at the differences in culture, the differences in where these colors were created or where these interiors were created in different places in the world will, you know, they will kick up, you know, all this information together will kick up perhaps new thinking or new thoughts about the importance of color in these interiors. And speaking of interiors, this is Eileen Gray's famous building or villa E1027, which she very carefully designed as her summer vacation house. Although she only stayed there once, I believe. She was meticulous about not only designing the building and the exterior and the building itself, but also the furniture and interiors. And then comes along Le Corbusier in his summer, summer outfit, painting some of the walls in Eileen Gray's house. And she really detested that. She really did not approve of that. So what do you do then when you make a conservation plan? How do you decide what to do with these paintings, with these wall paintings? Do you remove them because they were actually not Eileen Gray? Or do you leave them because they're Le Corbusier? Even though he had no permission to paint them, and even though she detested his paintings. So those are very complicated issues to grapple with when you draw up a conservation plan. So I think where they are at now is that they will preserve the paintings, but they're looking at creating a wall system or a curtain that they can hang, or can a fabric they can span tightly over the wall in times that they want to conceal the paintings, and during times that they want to show the paintings, they can remove that. I can skip this. This is Frank Lloyd Wright, a beautiful brick structure at Roby House in Chicago. This is an interesting building. This is where I was before I came here to Pristina. I was in Amsterdam for this housing complex called The Ship. This was built, it was completed in 1921. Drawings were begun in 1917. And it was meant to be, and it became a palace, or a living palace for laborers. And these were people that mostly worked in the dockyards, in the shipyards in Amsterdam. And the architect Michel de Klerk got this commission from a housing corporation that still owns this building until today. And they just completed a major renovation. And it's in the Amsterdam School, and I have no time to explain it, it's a pity, but I don't have. But the Amsterdam School is not only a very beautiful expressionist architecture, but it's also very witty. So, as part of the complex, there was a elementary school, there was a post office. So here you see some birds carved in the brick. Another part you see some young horses, carved in the brick, sort of pointing to the school. So there are all these little playful things that are going on. This is the earliest, in this part of Amsterdam, a telephone booth. So for the entire building, for more than 100 apartments, there was one telephone booth for the people who rented the apartments. And then the postmaster, there was a post office in this building as well, he also had his own telephone. Whenever you go to Amsterdam, if you have a chance to visit this place, it's just beautiful. Now, speaking of brick, I don't know if you know the work by Elio Diesta in Uruguay and some in Argentina, but it's absolutely worth looking into. Diesta was not an architect, but he was an engineer. But when you look at the building, I mean, he was a genius. I mean, he created these buildings with moving walls, pretensioned, reinforced brick, incredibly beautiful shapes. Look at this, look at the inside. I mean, this is just magic. Magic with bricks. Look how beautiful this is. And this is only one of some 300 works that he created. So I recommend if you like modern architecture in brick, do look up, here, let me go back quickly, Elio Diesta. Really wonderful. Le Corbusier, Pierre Généret, also an architecture, a building in Chandigarh. It's a museum there, and it's one of those 3 museums that Le Corbusier made, what he called the ever-expanding museum. So they were built like a snail shell, and his idea was that you could always add on and expand the museum that way. They're working on the conservation management plan. I'll go really quickly now, because I'm sure you're all dying for a beer and waiting to hear some good music and pizza. So this is Louis Chapel in Taiwan, beautiful concrete structure, but with interesting problems, because here you have roof tiles that were set into the concrete. So this presents another new layer of conservation problems, because the salts in the concrete go through the terracotta and push off some of the glazing. So that's a problem in itself. Melnikov House, conservation plan. So just in summary, so Keeping It Modern is fully international in scope. Most of the architecture that we support is formal architecture, so we think, we want architecture to be significant, because we also think that by supporting significant architecture, it becomes easier for people to look at it as a model and adapt models. Any buildings that we support cannot be privately owned, so that's one of the few limitations that we have. And we are not a government organization, so we are actually a completely independent foundation, independent trust. And so we can consider all types of architecture, but and any project that we receive is subject to peer review. So we typically receive like 3 times more the proposals that we're able to support. Now, of course, this is what you've all been waiting for. I know that you don't know about this building, but I can tell you it's really wonderful. I think it's a jewel in the center of Pristina. You can look at this building in many ways. Of course, there's the cube, there's the cupola, there is the reflection from Byzantine time, there is the the veil that you can link to Islamic time, to Islam. You can see the little cupolas as little diamonds, as little precious diamonds glittering on a piece of jewelry. This is just one of the most creative buildings I've ever seen. You know, and it's, when you look at Sydney Opera House, I don't think this building is less than that. It's really creative. And the conservation plan that Bacon and Noll and Rudina and others have been working on, it's exactly doing what the other projects are doing. So they're looking at the design, they're speaking with the architect, they're trying to get a sense of the building, they measure the building, they photograph the building, they note where the original materials are, they note where the problems are, they speak with the stakeholders, the difference with the mayor, with the cultural office, with the director of the library, with the conservation community, with architects. All that information, all these stakeholders, all the information you gather about why is a building so significant, that leads you to values, that understanding the value. And those values you can then in turn use to create policy. And that's the power of a conservation management plan, that finally you end up with policy. So you can say, these parts of the building are heritage, they're important, so we're not going to touch them, we're going to preserve them. But other parts of the building can be upgraded, can be used for modern, infrastructure, so that the library remains vibrant and active. So, based on values, based on policy, you can then help manage this building. I just included some photographs because I think it's just such a magical place. You've seen these. Look at this interior. I mean, who has ever created an interior like this? And it's functional. There's light, the acoustics, the wall panels, they muffle the sound. And this auditorium is worth every effort to preserve, every effort. Stakeholder meetings, the director's here, Noll is here, I think many members of the team are here. This is crucial to creating a conservation plan. My last favorite shot, and that's it. I'm stopping here. Let's end with this. Let's go to listen to music, drink some beer, and maybe I'd like to ask Bacon to stand here, because I think he deserves applause, not only for having led this project, but also for this really fantastic architecture festival. So Bacon and all the people.